Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Just going to wait for a few more people to join, and then we'll get started in a couple of minutes. Right, perfect. We will get started. Hopefully you can all hear me okay. So my name's Georgia. I am head of Wildflower here at John Chambers Wildflower Seed. As most of you will know, we are a seed supply company who supply wildflower seed on all scales, so background projects to national highways and everything sort of in between. So today's webinar is going to be sort of an introduction to wildflowers, why they're so important, and then also looking to establish new areas, enhancing other areas, and a little bit about pollinators too. So we now are in autumn sowing season. So this season probably starts normally weather dependent around September and runs till October. Although we do say that you can sow anytime really in this period, as long as a site isn't waterlogged, so it's not rained excessively, and if there isn't any sort of really harsh frosts either. Autumn sowing does offer quite a few benefits in comparison to a spring sowing. So a lot of the perennial wildflower seeds that we supply, our native species, do have quite hard shell coatings. So an autumn sowing can be more beneficial because when you sow in the autumn season, when the species are going through the winter period, all that sort of frosting and thaw that happens over the winter can be a little bit more beneficial, as it can crack the seed coatings. And then when you come to springtime, when the soil warms up and the weather gets a little bit warmer, those seed coatings have already cracked, so germination tends to be a little bit better. Obviously, now is ideal for sort of sowing. It's getting a little bit cooler. We've got a little bit more rain, which has been well needed over this period. So yeah, this is autumn sowing. A few of you might be sort of aware of this sort of statistic and fact, but we have lost a significant amount of our species-rich grasslands and meadows across Britain and the UK. This normally was sort of started probably in the 1920s due to sort of the war finishing. We needed the land for housing, for food, and a lot of these areas potentially weren't under sort of good enough protection at that time. So it meant that these areas were turned into other things. So what we do as a business is help to work with others to protect the areas that we do have and enhance what's there and look to extend those areas. And we also work to look at including new areas into sites. And wildflowers are becoming a lot more popular across the UK. They're sort of popping up here, there and everywhere. So it's really important that we provide guidance and advice on mixtures and species selection across varying different projects. So wildflowers are obviously really, really important because they provide food and shelter for numerous amounts of wildlife and insects. And they also improve soil structures too. So a lot of the wildflower mixtures and species of wildflower that you'll find together often have varying root structures. So some will have quite fibrous root structures and some will have deep tap roots. What that does is it just improves soil structures, which aids things like drainage from heavy rainfall. And it also helps to store more carbon too. And obviously more native wildflowers being available to our pollinators is arguably better for food production too. So the more pollinators that you have in the area, the better that is for food, as more food crops get pollinated. And when we talk about pollinators, I'm not just referring to sort of, your standard bees. There's obviously hundreds of varieties of bees, but also all the other types of pollinators that we don't often think about. So things like birds, things like beetles, wasps even. I know they can be seen as a little bit annoying when you're having a picnic in the park, but actually wasps are key pollinators too. And here at John Chambers, we really try and understand how these different pollinators will benefit from those individual species of wildlife. Because in reality, we are completely reliant on our pollinators. They are responsible for a third of the food that we eat. And a lot of the crops that we grow in the UK are reliant on our wild pollinators as well. So some of the ones that I've just mentioned. So not just your bees, but also your birds, your butterflies, your moths even. And a lot of the flowering plants in the UK, so up to 95% of them will need help with pollination. So it's really important that we include lots of different species in areas to really attract a different range of pollinators to an area. When we sort of look at which species of wildflowers can really help different species of wildlife, it really is important that we understand the sort of ecosystem and how that sort of works. So when we look at trying to attract more bats to the area, and bats are normally hunted by things like birds of prey, for instance, what we need to understand is what will attract bats to the area. And a lot of the time, bats obviously come out in the evening, so sort of at dusk time, those early evenings, you might see them flying around in your gardens. But what they're actually looking for is species such as moths and thrips that will also be sort of out at that time in the area. So then we look at, okay, which species of wildflower might be attractive to species like moths, and things like wild marjoram, which flower and release a scent in the evening time. They're really key species, along with things like bladdercampion too, to introduce into an area to attract then the moths, which in turn attracts the bats, and then in turn attracts the sort of birds of prey and gives them more food availability. So it's really important that we understand how each species of wildflower really works to improve the whole ecosystem going forward. This species is borage. Really lovely flower, so it's a blue one. And borage is really key for a lot of different species of bees because it produces all three different types of sugars. And some say it is very, very quick at replenishing its nectar source. There's been some statistics that suggest it could replenish its nectar supply every sort of 2 to 5 minutes, which is incredibly quick for a plant to reproduce. Normally plants could take sort of 24 hours. So this is a really, really popular one to include in mixtures when you're looking to attract bees to the area. So where might you find areas of wildflower? Well, they're becoming a lot more popular, and it's becoming a lot more popular in design to sort of include them in many different ways as well. So you might find them normally in sort of parks or recreational areas where an area has been left to sort of grow longer, or you might find them that in urban environments. We're getting a lot more sort of biodiverse green roofs specified across major cities as somewhere that can be a bit of a landing station for wildlife. And obviously when you've got skyscrapers, you've not got a lot of space on plots in very dense areas. So green roofs can be really key for providing sort of habitats for them. You might see them now in SUD schemes. So SUD schemes are sustainable urban drainage solutions. So things like swales or rain gardens that help to absorb a lot of water, a lot of rainfall that we do see in the UK. We do tend to have quite a lot of rain when it does come. Wildflowers can be great at that. They can sort of settle into an environment and they'll be tolerant of being flooded in the water in the winter time when we do have a lot of rain. But then also when we have our really dry periods that we have seen this summer, they can also be tolerant of that too. Road verges, you'll probably see on the motorways as well. There's a lot more wildflowers that are coming up there. A lot of this is to do with relaxed cutting regimes, which is really beneficial. And a lot of road verges now you'll see flowering from, really early in the season right up till the sort of end. And also restoration areas, so your actual traditional meadows, that will also be a massive area to sort of look into. So establishing existing paddocks to include more wildflowers, or whether there is an existing area that has a few wildflower species in that we're wanting to enhance and get more diversity in there, so you can sort of extend the flowering period too. So they're popping up sort of everywhere. So when you have a new project and you're sort of looking to choose or specify a seed mixture, what we would normally start with or recommend you doing is looking into your sort of site conditions and sort of letting us know about those. So where is that site? Is it right near the coast? What sort of vegetation is already on site? Have you already got some wildflowers on the site already? And that can give us an indication of sort of things about your soil, or which other species might be sort of comfortable and be able to get established in those areas. You then obviously want to choose an appropriate mixture, but you also need to understand which mixture and the maintenance requirements you're going to be able to do. So if you've got a site that, for instance, is a really steep slope, actually you might need to choose a mixture with a slightly different ratio of grass to wildflowers, because you know that maintenance and site access to that site is going to be quite difficult too. The other thing to consider is, does your site flood in the winter time? And that might change when we recommend you sow or establish a wildflower area. If you've got a site near a riverbank, for instance, and you know that river does flood quite frequently in the winter, we might suggest that you actually sow in spring instead, just so that you give the wildflowers the best chance of sort of germinating and establishing. So the first factor to look at when you've got you've decided your site area is your soil type. So we would just need to know whether there is any sort of extreme soil type. So whether you've got a soil that's really heavy clay or really water retentive, or have you got a sort of sandy soil that lets a lot of water through, so it's really free draining and therefore becomes really dry in the summertime? Or is this a field that's been existing farming, intensely farmed area, so actually there's been a lot of fertilizer that's been put on there, so actually you've got a really high nutrient soil with a lot of nitrogen in there. So those are certain things to look at to begin with. Then the next factor to look at is your sort of general environment. So is that area in shade? Is it near a water's edge? Is it on a slope that's actually really, really sunny because it's south facing, it's in full sun, so it's going to get quite dry? Is it in an area near a car park where actually the roads get quite wet and you're going to get a lot of spray from cars driving past? That will tell us that actually we need something that's potentially a little bit more used to sort of salty water being sprayed at it. So even a coastal mixture might be more appropriate. So just tell us a little bit about your general sort of environment. And then whether you've got a conservation focus. So do you know that there is bats in the area, or do you know that you are looking to put in a mixture because you've got a site with someone that's keeping local bees or honeybees? So what is the main conservation focus? Or is it just generally you're looking to include a wide range of species that's sort of attractive to all different types of pollinators? And then the next decision you need to make is whether you want grass included in your mixture or whether you just want wildflowers. Now, including grasses in mixtures does hold quite a few benefits, especially if you're using it on a slope, for instance. It can be really good for sort of establishing the wildflowers into that and sort of keeping the soil in place. So it's good for preventing sort of soil erosion as well. And also in the winter period, the grasses that will keep the area looking green over the winter time. But it might be that actually you've got a border or a bed in your garden that you're wanting to have more impact of sort of the wildflowers there. So you're not really wanting as much grass, or you're not wanting any grass at all. If you're looking at sort of producing a more ornamental display, you might just want to have 100% wildflowers there. And that's absolutely fine as well. There's a little bit less maintenance that goes with that, and I'll explain that shortly. But just to be aware that in the first few years, if you do have just wildflowers there, especially the perennial ones, although there is some foliage that will come from the perennial species, it might be a few years before that sort of builds up and really gives a coverage across the bed. So you need to be aware of any weed species that might blow into the bare soil that could be left after you've done your sort of annual cuts. So the different types of mixtures. So as I mentioned, 100% wildflower seed mixtures. These generally tend to be mainly perennial. seed mixes, and they'll be designed to suit, as I said, different soils, different environmental conditions, so like a woodland mixture or a pond edge mixture, and they're all designed with species that will be naturally found in those environments in the wild. With 100% just perennial mixtures, you just need 2 grams per square metre, and the maintenance for these is pretty easy, but I'll come on to that shortly. The next type of mixture is sort of your annual naturalised native mixtures. So you things like your poppy, cornflowers, called chamomile. These are great to put down if you've got an area that you are looking to introduce something and you need just flowering for a year to sort of cover a bed, or these work quite well when you see them in public areas, so things like roundabouts or entrances to villages, because they give a real boost of colour. They cut down on maintenance for sort of local councils because you can sow these either in autumn or spring and then leave them for the remainder of the season. You can mix these with perennial mixtures too. So if you were doing that, you would want 2 grams of your perennial mixture with 1 gram of your annuals. So your total sowing rate would be 3 grams per square metre. But they can work really well adding them with perennial mixtures, because they will, if your perennials are taking a little bit longer to sort of establish, the annuals can sort of fill in any gaps you might get from sort of sowing a perennial mix. We do have a range of seed that we call our impact range. So these are specific mixtures designed with sort of horticultural varieties of species into. A lot of these are annual mixtures, again, so similar to the previous slide, but a lot of these will contain sort of nectar and pollen-rich garden varieties or cultivars of the wild species. So poppy, for instance, you'll get different coloured poppies, so you'll get the Californian like orange one, pink ones, and they do make a really lovely display. They are fantastic at just giving you sort of, season-long flowering from sort of June till sort of late in the season, and they're very low impact because you just basically sow down and then leave it for the remainder of the season. And then your last type is your grass and wildflower mixtures. So this is what we would call our sort of hay meadow type mixtures. These normally come as 80-20s. As you might have heard them being referred to. So 80% grass seed to 20% wildflower, which does seem quite a different ratio, but generally as a traditional meadow, that's the kind of ratio that you would get, grass versus wildflower. And with your wildflower, you hope to have sort of 10 to 12 species per square metre. That would be pretty good. Some of the species on there, you see like the field scabious, the knapweed, the oxeye daisy. So this will probably be sort of earlier summer, so maybe June time, that this would be flowering, and you've got some grasses included in that as well. These types of mixtures do take a little bit of maintenance in the first year, and it's really key that this maintenance is sort of carried out, but I'll discuss that sort of later. So you've decided the kind of mixture that you need, a little bit more about your soil type, where the mixture is going, whether you want some grasses included or your annuals included. So then you need to start preparing your site. Now this is just specifically for sites where you are removing the vegetation that's there already. So if you've got an area of amenity lawn, for instance, with ryegrass in, we would always recommend to remove what's there before you then establish your wildflowers. Sites, particularly with bad weeds in or brambles or things like docks or ryegrass, make it very, very difficult for the wildflowers to sort of grow and establish in those areas. So I would say to remove them. That's normally the best thing to do. This is a site that we worked on. This is last autumn, a year ago. So you can kind of see from that image that's generally what you're sort of aiming for. Getting rid of everything on site is pretty impossible. So there is still, some maintenance that we've had to do through this year, but ideally you'd want sort of as much bare soil there as possible. You want to prepare the area by then raking over, and then when you sow your seed, ideally you'd want to sort of then roll the seed just into the soil surface. It doesn't need to be buried or anything. You don't need to sort of, cover it with compost, because if we're trying to mimic the conditions that these species would have in the wild. So if you think about species on a road verge, for instance, when they have dispersed their seed, they are just dropping that seed into the grass verge, and the seed's then sitting there over the winter period. And as I mentioned at the start, a lot of the perennial species will benefit from some frost and thaw through the winter. So actually leaving them more exposed is generally more beneficial to sort of germination. And there's a little bit of a myth with wildflowers that they will sort of grow on, really poor soils, which is true to some extent. But what we mean by poor soils is we mean lower nutrient. And there's a big difference between a good quality soil and a poor quality soil that's what's included into it. So if you've got an area of rubble in your garden, or you've got a soil that's really full of stones, your wildflowers will find it difficult to establish in those sorts of conditions. It's not saying that they won't grow, but it is saying that they will do better on better quality soil that's free from rubble, rocks, because they still need a substrate to grow into. Lower nutrient soil is more ideal if you are sowing grasses in your mixture. It's not necessary to an extent. You don't have to have lower nutrient soil. We can work with the soil that you do have on site. But lower nutrient just basically allows the wildflowers to grow better because it doesn't give the grasses as much nutrients to grow, so they won't grow as vigorously. Wildflowers, although they're native to the UK, they're not the strongest of growers, so they do find it quite difficult to compete with grass species sometimes. This is also why sometimes you'll see people using sort of subsoil. So there's a process called soil inversion, which flips the topsoil and subsoil up by really deeply ploughing it, because that subsoil tends to be lower nutrient. So when you're establishing, wildflowers and grasses into an area, that's ideal, and it can be used for that too. So this is just a reminder of the sowing rates that we would suggest. So perennial only mixtures, 2 grams a square metre. Perennial and annuals is 3 grams. Grass and wildflowers, so your 80-20 standard mixtures, 5 grams a square metre. And anything bespoke, so if you've got a steep slope, we might recommend doing sort of a 50-50 mix, and just adjusting that ratio of grass to wildflower, just because of the maintenance, but I'll come on to that in a second. So we'd probably recommend a sowing rate of 4 grams a square metre, so a little bit less. So it's not a lot of seed, definitely not a lot in comparison to traditional amenity grass sowing, for instance, but a lot of the wildflower species that we supply will have, they all vary in how many seeds per gram they have. So actually when you're sowing a mixture, you can be putting down thousands of seeds per square metre, just because of how tiny some of the seeds can be. I mean, poppy and things like red campion, for instance, have about 10,000 seeds per gram. So when you look at that in a mixture, it's a lot of seed to be putting down. So maintenance-wise, so just 100% wildflower mixtures only will need basically 1 cut per year. So you would sow it in the autumn time, so now, and then you would basically leave that to grow all the way up until this time next year, or basically when the area's gone over. As I said, this is the same for sort of perennials and perennials with annuals too. And when you do your final cut, you could leave those stems to sort of lie for a couple of days just to let any other seed drop out the flower heads. But then you would always want to remove your cuttings. And the reason you'd want to do that is because any cuttings that are left to sort of lie in the area will rot down and add nutrients to the soil. So then in time, if you do get any weed or grass species creeping in the area, which is quite likely, it's all outside, it's all exposed to nature, the extra nutrients will just fuel the weeds and the grass growth, not necessarily the wildflowers. So then you find that you get, sort of weeds coming into the area and establishing sort of quite well. If you've got a site where, it's quite difficult to remove those cuttings, just site access wise, for instance. You could do what we call and leave like habitat heaps. So you'd basically clump up all of your cuttings and leave them in sort of mounds at the side of the site. And then things like mice and birds will use these for sort of nesting materials. So that can work quite well if you don't have the ability to remove the cuttings completely. Your maintenance for your 80-20 mixtures is a little bit different. So because there's more grass being sown than wildflower, it's really important that we keep the amount of, or keep the establishment going by keeping the grasses shorter to allow your perennial species in particular to sort of get established. So if you sow in the autumn, so sow anytime now, next year, probably from about May time, the area will need regular cuts, so every sort of 3 to 4 weeks through the main growing season. And what that does is it keeps the grass sward lower, so lets enough light and air and moisture get into the sward. So any small amount of foliage or seedlings that are growing from the wildflowers, they can sort of have access to this, and because they'll focus on putting a root system down, they'll use that, light, air, sunshine, to really harness that energy and put that into the root. So you won't necessarily be damaging anything by doing these cuts, but what you're stopping happening is all of the grasses, shooting up and growing quite tall to say, 30, 40 centimeters, and your wildflowers will get lost really deep down in the sward, and they'll just really struggle to establish. A lot of the time when we see sites that this doesn't happen, the maintenance isn't happening, the cuts aren't being done, is by their sort of second year, everything grows, and all you sort of end up with is a lot of grass and a few oxide disease and a couple of knapweeds. And there isn't really a lot of balance between the wildflowers and grasses, so it is really important this maintenance is done. Cuts normally sort of every 3 to 4 weeks, as I said, and normally a highest setting on a mower or a strimmer to about sort of 75 to 100 mil is what you're sort of aiming for to cut the sward back down to. And you do this until your final cut in the sort of autumn time. And again, as per the 100% instructions, you always want to remove your cuttings after you've done them, just so that there's not any sort of, dense vegetation sort of stopping anything from growing, preventing light getting to the sward, and also rotting down and adding more nutrients to that soil. So it is really important that these sort of cuts are removed. So obviously this year with the weather, it's been varied, the recommendations we've given on maintenance for some areas, because the weather started quite warm in sort of, at the end of spring, early summer. A lot of areas actually flowered and sort of went over quite quickly. So we were seeing some areas finishing sort of, June, July time, whereas normally we'd expect these to run till, really mid-August. And in some sites, in some scenarios, we've been able to recommend another cut being done. And that's actually allowed another flowering period to come through. So it's extended that flowering season. But obviously the climate and the weather does change every single year. So our recommendations of what we would say to do does vary slightly too. And as I mentioned earlier, if you have got a site where it's difficult to access or it's on a slope, so actually realistically getting a strimmer up there is going to be quite difficult, we might suggest to you sowing like a different ratio of grass to wildflower. So 50-50 ratio, for instance, and that will require less cuts because the grasses aren't going to be as vigorous and will let the wildflowers sort of establish easier. Obviously that does change the cost of things, but it means that maintenance isn't going to have to be done as frequently, which actually makes it more manageable on site. So if you do have an area and you think there's something not quite, it's not looking as good as it could be, or it's flowered really early this year, or we get to sort of the end of May, June time, and you think it's just dominated by one species, give us a call and we can give you some sort of guidance on maintenance at that point. It might be that we recommend doing a full cut there and then, just to bring the sward back down, sort of reset it so it allows the sward to sort of start blooming again. But yeah, bespoke maintenance has become something we sort of do a lot here because of how much the climate is changing and the weather is quite unpredictable. So all of what I've spoken about just from now has been sort of establishing an area from bare soil, so a new area. But we do often have sites where actually you might already have a nice area with a few wildflower species in there, and actually what you're wanting to do is just enhance what's there. So include some more wildflower species to sort of extend the flowering period, or introduce specific species that you know are attractive to butterflies. And there are a few different ways you can sort of carry this out, so enhancing what's already there. And results do vary based on each of the options. And as long as the right maintenance and the preparation is done, they can be, successful. So the first option is to, in the autumn time, if you've got your area, you would want to cut the area back as you would do normally at this time. And then you would want to ideally scarify what's there. Now, scarifying won't really damage, the root systems a lot of the time, especially if you've got grasses in there. The grasses won't be damaged, they will come back. And a lot of your perennial species they store all their energies in the root system. So really all you're doing is just ripping up the top vegetation from the area just to expose some more bare soil. So you won't really damage what's there. You'd then want to sow 100% wildflower into that. And if you were looking at introducing specific species, we can look at just doing a mix of, say, 5 species that you're wanting, or you look at doing a big mix that is going to give you more options, or more chance of more species sort of establishing and germinating. And then because it's going into an existing area with grass, you would need to undertake the cuts as you would sort of an 80-20 style sow mixture through that first season, just to keep the grasses down and then let those new seedlings sort of establish. So it's a little bit, you're sacrificing sort of a season's worth of flowering, but that means the following year you should have a reasonable amount more flowers sort of established into that area too. The next option is to introduce a species called yellow rattle. Some of you might have heard of it. A lot of people refer to it as sort of the meadow maker in the wildflower world, because it's a key one and a species that we include in pretty much all of our mixtures. And the good thing about yellow rattle is that it's actually like semi-parasitic. So what it does is once it's established, it latches onto grass seed roots and strips some of the moisture out of those roots, which sounds pretty horrible. But what it does is it slows the grass growth down and allows the sward to become more open. So it's basically a more natural way of doing that scarification process I've just spoken about, but you're doing that with a plant species basically. Yellow rattle is always best sown in autumn because the germination of it does tend to drop by sort of springtime. And once it's established in an area, although it is an annual, it's very, very good at self-seeding. So it will spread itself around and really get established. And once it's got a latch on those grasses, then you could look at introducing more wildflowers into that. So if you were to sow yellow rattle this autumn, ideally you'd want to give it a full season so it can, sort of germinate, latch onto the grasses, flower, produce more seed, spread that around and really get a tackle on the sward. And then this time, the following year, you could then look at sowing into the sward your 100% wildflowers, and that would also reduce any cuts that you'd need to do as well. So you wouldn't have to do those cuts if your yellow rattle is established, because your sward's been opened up by that. If you're just sowing yellow rattle into an area, you don't need a lot of seed at all. It's about 300 to 400 grams seeds per gram of this species, so you're getting quite a lot in that. So we normally say about 0.5 to 1 gram per square metre if you're looking to sort of sow that. And we have got now fresh harvest seed in, so that's this year's harvest of yellow rattle. So ideally that would be the best to use. Or your third option would be to introduce plug plants. So this is becoming a really popular way of enhancing an area, particularly when you have got a specific species that you're looking to implement, or you've got a site with quite challenging conditions. So it is up on a green roof, and you've got not a very deep substrate depth, or you're looking at introducing an area in a swale scheme, and actually a lot of the time it does flood and retracts. Plug plants can be a really good way of ensuring that the plant is there and the species is already germinated. As long as it gets planted okay and it receives the right maintenance, actually that species should survive and sort of thrive in that area. We can price these all as individual species. So if you were thinking, okay, I know I've got a green roof that I'm seeding, but actually species like cowslip and primrose are quite difficult to germinate and a little bit unpredictable. I'm going to plant these plugs. We can do it that way. Normally we say anything between 5 and 25 per square metre, depending on what you're doing. You'll need less if you're planting into quite an established sward of other wildflowers being there, or if you're looking at doing this from new. So if you've got a lawn that you're thinking, actually, I want to plant some plugs in here to increase the biodiversity in my garden, you might want to plant them more densely at sort of 25 per square metre. But it really just depends on the project and the budget that's there too. Normally we suggest planting in sort of small groups together, so maybe 2 or 3 in a little group, or even up to 5, because then it just allows them to sort of establish a little bit better. And over the period, once you've got the sort of more established, it just does give it a little bit of a better effect. Plug plants can be normally planted sort of most of the time in the season. It's just based on when they're looking the best, and obviously following the life cycle of a wildflower. In the winter period, they are just mainly a root system. So if you're looking at sort of planting in the springtime, it might be that your plugs don't have a massive amount of foliage on them yet, but it's fine. As long as the root system is there, they will grow and they will look, they look fine in a few weeks' time once they've had a little bit more time to grow. And just lastly, the other thing that you could do to sort of enhance an area further is to introduce things like bulbs. So our native bulbs, you things like your winter aconite, your snowdrops, your bluebells, your narcissus, all those classic signs of sort of winter going into spring, are actually really important plants to introduce and have access to for our other pollinators that we might not necessarily think of when we think about bees flying around in the summer. Bulbs are available now. They are dried at the moment because they're autumn planted. So you'd plant them now, and these would flower from any time really from January up until the springtime. And then your other wildflower species will kind of, come into their own and start flowering from that point. But it's a really good way of sort of extending the flowering period and offering sort of nectar and food for our pollinators when we might not necessarily think about it. And we do also have pre-grown turf, which is an option that we offer. So this is becoming quite popular for sites where germination or seeding is quite difficult to do, or say you've got a sud scheme or a riverbank, for instance, and it floods. A pre-grown turf is often a better option to put down on sort of a slope that is going to get flooded. Obviously not something that would be waterlogged, for instance, but actually it means that the species are already established, and within a few sort of weeks they'll be quite well rooted into the area, so it gives them a better chance of sort of establishing in more challenging conditions. Matting or turf is more expensive, but normally when you receive it, it's sort of 6 to 8 months establishment already down the line, so you're not having to worry about which species are going to germinate. Am I going to have enough flowering for next year? It's a quicker option to be able to get something more sort of established in an area. And then just lastly, just before I finish up and answer any questions, some of you may have seen, so obviously John Chambers is a part of the bigger group of Green Tech, and we are holding an event, a free event in Manchester, and this is all about designing with climate resilience. So it's on the 30th of September. I've left the QR code there if you want to sign up, if there's anybody that is interested. I'm going to be doing a talk on sort of biodiversity net gain and getting the most out of how to design and implement wildflowers specifically in the urban environment, and how we can use these best for our pollinators, where actually it's not as easy to sort of get our wildlife as a priority because there's so much urban areas there. There's other talks on SUD schemes there too, and sort of how to harvest rainwater and new technologies in that. So if anybody is interested, I'll leave the link in the chat as well. But just lastly, thank you sort of for your time today. It's just been a whistle-stop tour on sort of wildflowers and establishing them. I'm going to just have a look in the chat and just answer any questions that are in there. But any others, pop in there now and I'll have a read down and see if I can sort of answer them. So I've had a question about germination after an autumn sowing before winter. It really depends on the weather and what the weather does. If it gets quite cold quite quickly, then chances are you will sort of have bare ground for a little bit. If our weather, which sometimes it can do, goes through a cold period, then warms up a little bit and then goes back into a cold period, you might get some species germinating, especially the quicker establishing perennial species, things like oxeye daisy, knapweed. They can establish and germinate quite quickly. So yes, sometimes you do have quite a bare soil over the winter period. That's very common, but sometimes you will have some things that will sort of establish. Our advice most of the time is just to wait and see what it looks like in spring. You'd be surprised at how many sites we sort of have and people panic ring us in sort of, even March, April time and say nothing's really happening. But actually, if we've had a really cold spring, then things won't be happening because the soil hasn't warmed up yet. So it's normally just best to trust the process, leave it, and then see what it's looking like, early summer, and start there. Yes, the recording will be available. If you wouldn't mind just emailing the email address that's on there and just asking for the recording, we'll reply directly to that. But I have recorded this, so we can sort that. Question about how can you check if the soil is nutrient rich? So you can sometimes get an idea just based on how your other vegetation grows in that soil. If you find that plants grow particularly tall, for instance, or they establish really well, it's generally a sign that your soil is nutrient rich. You can have your soil tested, but it's not necessarily and can be quite costly. But there might be other ways that you can sort of test for your soil on how good it is. It's normally easier to tell whether you have quite poor soil because chances are you'll find that nothing kind of grows and does well there. But yeah, hopefully that's sort of answered that one. There is probably things we can do, but normally it is just checking the vegetation, the other plants that are there already, and that kind of gives you an idea about how your soil might be performing already. Annual mixtures can be sown in autumn or spring, or you can do both, which is a bit of a curveball. So if you sow in the autumn, absolutely fine. You'll find that your annuals will flower earlier and probably finish about July time. If you flower in the spring, they will germinate and flower a little bit later. So if you had an annual mixture and you were able to split it down and do half and half, so you sow half in the autumn and half in the spring, what that can do is actually just extend that flowering period. So your autumn sown annuals will come through first, and when they start to sort of die off and finish flowering, your spring flowering annuals can come through then. So it just extends the flowering period, which is often quite a good thing to do. But yeah, normally your naturalized native annual mixtures can be sown in either. Some of the impact mixtures, so your non-native species, will be spring sown only. That's only because normally they've come from their origin country is normally a lot hotter, so they don't do well with frost, for instance, but we can sort of specify on each one which is when's best to sow it. Yes, you could look at putting turf down if mice or other things are a problem on site, or birds. We get a lot of birds sort of eating some of the seed. Normally when people sort of say they have birds on site, we would normally say to sow 10% more seed, just so you've got a little bit of a buffer. And the other thing you could do is cover it with something like a light compost, just because the seed isn't then as visible to things like vermin or other wildlife species in the garden. Unfortunately, most projects, nature does have a way of getting involved. But perseverance, there's definitely other options out there, and matting and turf is probably one of them. And plugs as well. So that might be something to look into. What is the time where seed would know? So seed germination rates will depend on the species and the type of seed. So grass germination tends to drop quicker than wildflower. If some of the perennial wildflower species, if they're kept in the right conditions, so in an area that's low humidity, cool temperatures and reasonably dry, they can last up to sort of 4 or 5 years before we start seeing germination drop. Grass seed is a little bit less. That's probably only going to last a couple of years before you do see a decline. Saying that though, we've had seed that's been on site for a couple, 3 years, and someone's popped it down and it's germinated absolutely fine. I would say give it a go if you've got spare seed, and just see what happens, and then see what germinates as well. And then you could kind of work out what you'd need to germinate to. The other thing I should mention is that when we talk about germination, sometimes with some species, there's a big time difference between germination and actually the time of flowering. So species like bluebell that we would put into a woodland mixture, it might germinate in the first year, but you're not going to see that flower for 5 years, because it needs 5 winter periods before that small seed then prepares itself as a bulb and then has enough energy to then flower. Another reason why they're normally sold as bulbs. So even if you do put the seed down and you see some things germinate, you might have to wait a couple of years before you see the rest of the mixture. Especially with perennial species, they do take a little bit longer. No, you can sow 100% flower mixture into a prepared bed. That's absolutely fine. The only thing to watch out for is if there is anything that sort of creeps in over the winter period, so any weed species, but you'll be able to see these kind of germinate in the springtime. A lot of people will ask, how do you know the difference between a wildflower seedling and a weed? A lot of the time it's very difficult. You don't know when the seedlings. Our advice is normally to leave it until they are bigger, because it makes weeding a little bit easier. You've got more of a plant to grab hold of, to pull it out. And the other thing, there's more identifiable features of the foliage that you can really pick up on, so you can tell the difference between which one is meant to be there and which one you don't want there. But yeah, sowing now 100% flower mixture is absolutely fine, is what we'd encourage you to do. And no, there's no sort of cover crop you'd need over the winter. The only thing that would do is potentially, I suppose you could do it, it's just how long it would last for. You wouldn't want to stunt the growth of anything that starts then germinating sort of early spring. So there's a question here on an existing grass sward of predominantly Yorkshire fog. So we wouldn't recommend sowing an 80-20 into an established grass sward, because you will create too much competition with too many of the grasses being there. What you could do is, if you were looking at introducing specific grass species, is to get your wildflowers established in the area first and then look at putting more grass in there, because it's a lot easier to get grasses established into an area than it is wildflowers into the area. So I would say just stick with 100% wildflower, let that get established, get really settled into the sward, and then look at introducing more grasses if that's the sort of the key of what you're trying to do. There is a question on grazing and whether the cuts are necessary if you plan on grazing in August to September. What I would say is probably grazing is there as an alternative to cutting. So it will probably need a few cuts in the summer anyway, and then grazing in the sort of August, September, because those cuts in that first season allow obviously the perennials to sort of germinate and get established. So whether you're grazing then later in the season, those cuts are still needed in that first part of the summer. It just might mean that you only do sort of 2 or 3 early summer and then let it get a little bit longer for grazing. But they are still probably needed just to keep the sward sort of shorter, to let the wildflowers kind of establish, and then you can look at sort of grazing. And grazing in March is again fine. And actually sometimes we do recommend a cut in the springtime if we've had quite a mild winter and it gets to sort of March, April, and all in the sward all you can kind of see is just the grass species. We would sometimes recommend a cut really early spring just to reset the sward and pull it back to normal. But with that question, we might be able to give sort of better advice if we know what's been sown and how it's been sort of undertaken. So if you want to email us with any follow-up questions on that, we can have a look at it. But I think that is everything for now. Thank you all for listening and for some really interesting questions. Hope you've all enjoyed that. As I said, the details are on the screen now, so if anybody does have any site-specific questions or any other queries, just get in touch. It'll either be myself or one of the team that sort of comes back to you. And have a lovely rest of the day, everyone. Thank you very much.